development. So I bring on a really interesting group of people. So let's talk about some of the speakers today, two of the speakers. So David is the CIO of the FCC. He's an Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia, co-chair of the IEEE Committee on Artificial Intelligence and Innovative Policies, and a Harvard executive in residence. So if everybody could please welcome David.
Thank you. Raise your hand twice. All right, we have some people that are doing one. How many people are concerned about complexity? And how many people think we will figure out solutions that will get us past the complexity we're facing? All right, that just helps me get a sense of where we're at. So I'm here to try and talk to you about the importance of change agents in exponential times. And in talking a little bit with Bill, I really want to jump as quickly as possible to a fireside chat. But he tried to convince both Nagesh and I to try and give you sort of an initial overview as to how we sort of think in our philosophy and the message we're trying to bring. In particular, one thing that I'm going to try and leave you with is that the word government is an increasingly out-of-date term. It's a 20th century term. And really what I want to try and convince you is to think about the word of public service. And I'd ask this question is, how many of you have a smartphone? I would assume most of us people do. How many of you, if you knew that the data was going to be kept anonymous and private, would be willing to share data on air quality, water quality, transportation quality, energy efficiency, if you knew it was kept anonymous and private and it would help make your local community healthier or safer to live in? So I raise that because packet latency is no longer 3 days between New York and DC on horseback. Packet latency is now milliseconds. And so we can think about not doing things that were done traditionally by government because communication had latency issues and had distance issues. But now we can actually involve you directly if you want. You don't have to if you don't want to. We can involve private sector partnerships, and we can involve government professionals as trusted brokers. But that's why the word public service is more apt for the era we're going into as opposed to government alone. First question, though, is who knows what this is a photo of? Flak jacket, yes. And the reason why I want to show you a flak jacket is we often confuse the difference between leadership and management. Management is when you meet expectations, and we all have to meet that to a degree, whether they're the expectations of our boss, our peers, our reports. In the case of public service, we have expectations from the Congress, the administration, and the public. If we don't meet expectations to a certain degree, we are quickly out of a job. But I say at the same time, in this world that we're talking about, this exponential changing world, we need leadership. And leadership comes from the Greek word leet, which means to be sent unto death. Because that's what's back in ancient Greece. The leets were the ones that carried a flag in front of the melee army. And that's all well and good until one melee army meets another melee army, and the first to die are the leets. Nelson Mandela said his most trying moment as a leader was not with any external adversary, but when he had to turn to his own party, the African National Congress, and convince them to make peace with the white minority in South Africa. He almost had a coup. Isaac Rabin, an Israeli, is when he turned to his own Israeli citizens and said, we're going to make peace with the Palestinians, that unfortunately he was killed and assassinated by a fellow Israeli. When you step outside of expectations, if you don't manage that friction, it can be your death either physically or metaphorically. And so our challenge is we're facing a world of exponential change, but are we managing the friction? Are we donning our flak jackets to be able to provide that leadership to help people through with that exponential change? Or is the friction going to get so high that that ends up being something that metaphorically or physically kills us along the way? So that gets to the importance of change agents, and hopefully I can convince you tonight to be a change agent. And to be a change agent, you have to be willing to don your flak jacket and step outside of status quo. But most importantly, manage the friction of doing that. Too often people invoke change and they want change, but they create a whole lot of heat and light. It doesn't actually move the car forward. And what we really want is if you're going to create friction, make sure it's productive, make sure it's meaningful, and it moves us somewhere together. Recognizing this is an exponential crowd, I won't go too far into this other than to say this is us, 3.7 billion miles away, a photo taken by Voyager I in 1990. And it literally took 5.5 hours for light to be reflected from our planet to Voyager I, and another 5.5 hours for the radio transmission to be sent back to reconstruct that image. Now, Voyager I launched in 1977. At that point in time, we're looking at about 4.2 billion human beings on the face of the planet. GDP is about 7 trillion. And for those of you who were around in 1977, you may remember the Apple II going on sale with a whopping 4 kilobytes of RAM. That was state of the art at the time. By the time Voyager I has traveled its 3.7 billion miles to 1990, we're now looking at GDP that has tripled. Windows 3.0 goes on sale. And for those of you who remember, a young Tim Berners-Lee turns on the first web server ever in December of that year at CERN. Any guesses as to how many web servers are on the face of the planet now? Just web servers. They're here 10 million? 1.1 billion. And the last 350 million came online in the last 2 years. Again, this is not linear change, this is exponential change. So I'm going to pause at 2013 because I would be willing to bet 20 years from now, historians will say 2013 was the year we made history and most of us never recognized it. There are 7.1 billion human beings on the face of the planet that year and 7.1 billion network devices. Though obviously not equitably distributed. There are certain places where, of course, nobody has any network device, and then here in the United States, we probably have several people, probably most of the people here in this room, where we have at least 5 or 6 different network devices in 2013. Now we're probably looking at 10 to 14 in our households alone. This is not linear change. In terms of data on the face of the planet, we're looking at 4 zettabytes, 4 billion terabytes of data on the face of the planet in 2013. Library of Congress is 10 terabytes. So I'm talking about 400 million versions of the Library of Congress on the face of the planet. Now I'm sure some of those are cat videos and a lot of YouTube videos. But it raises interesting questions about where we're going because that's going to also double at least every 18 months. So 2022, less than 6 years from now, 2022, we're looking at 8 billion people on the face of the planet. Right now we have a little bit less than 3.4 billion have access to the internet. By 2022, it's looking at 7 billion. So 85% of the planet will have access to the internet. GDP is anybody's guess. We're looking at between 75 and 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet. If we don't think we already have cybersecurity issues, we will definitely by then. This train called the IoT will hit this train called cybersecurity, and all of a sudden we'll realize maybe this wasn't a good idea. Especially when you actually look at people that are talking about providing internet through power. So, you know, some of those people that say don't plug in that USB device, it might get contaminated. Well, what do you do when the internet's actually coming from your very own power source? That'll also be an interesting challenge that we'll have to address. 96 billion terabytes of data, 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress. According to some statistics, that's more data than all human eyes see in the course of a year, or twice as much data in all the conversations we've ever had as a species. Google search will no longer work at that point because we don't go past the first or second or third pages of search results. If it hasn't happened already, there will be things that happen both in the private sector and the public sector where if you knew A, B, C, and D, and in fact you did, but you didn't put it together, you could have either seized on some new opportunity or avoided some disaster. This is going to stress and challenge organizations of all types, nations, and communities. And this is going to happen in 6 years or less. So, this gets to the importance of public service, and I define public service as what do we, the people, choose to do together that we cannot do alone. And that again gets to what I was trying to convince you is, don't think of government. Government is an outdated 20th century term. Instead, think of public service that includes you as the public if you want. You don't have to. In fact, there's really only 2 things you have to do in the United States. One is occasionally serve on a jury, and 2, pay taxes. Otherwise, you don't have to serve in the military if you don't want to. You don't have to do government service if you don't want to. You don't even have to vote if you don't want to. Whereas in Australia, you do. That is part of what makes us great, is there's really not much you have to do. But if you want, you can be a change agent that actually contributes as a member of the public without becoming a government professional. You can also be a private sector partner that is willing to think beyond your own individual bottom line and think the triple bottom line of your own individual profits, but also profits to the community and good to the global good as a whole as well. Or you can be a government worker. And it's this triangle that's necessary because all 3 have to work together to move things forward. And it's worth noting, at least for our US audience, and I recognize we have international audience in here, that when the Constitution was signed, supposedly Ben Franklin said he could rest easy knowing the great American experiment will continue to exist for the next 50 years. Now, obviously, that was 240 years ago, and we may be due for some new experiments now. But it's worth thinking about how we use the word experiment as well, because experiment and expertise both have the same root, experia, out of danger. And that the only way you get expertise is you do experiments, which by definition are dangerous things. Startups get this. It's often about rapidly pivoting until you figure out your market niche. But where in public service are we allowed to do experiments, other than places like DARPA and IARPA? How many people are aware of the Corona Project in the 1950s? Corona Project? If you're not, Google it. It's worth checking it out. Late 1950s, 1957, ARPA was charged with launching rockets that would go into space and take photos of the Soviet Union long before NASA got anything up. The first 13 rockets blew up on the launch pad and never got off the ground. Imagine nowadays if we had some government effort that had 13 different rocket explosions. We never would have done it. We would have stopped after 2 or 3. There would have been congressional hearings and it would have been killed. We have lost the willingness to experiment, and then we're surprised when we're not adapting to the changing world. So I raise questions for you. Where are those safe places for people to experiment in the civilian sector? Another case in point. Who knows who this is a photo of? Anyone with the US Navy? 1904, this is a young Ensign Nimitz with the US Navy. He ran his boat aground, the USS Decatur, in the Philippines in 1904. He was court-martialed but not drummed out of the Navy, and instead was signed to submarines, which was not a glorious assignment in 1904. 35 years later, however, he became one of only 2 5-star admirals we've ever had, responsible for winning the war in the Pacific. Now imagine nowadays a lieutenant or lieutenant commander runs their boat aground in the Pacific. How long on Twitter and Facebook would have been fire Nimitz? How many news pundits and comedians would have been, how could they have possibly done it? And they would have been called before Congress probably, and their boss's boss, all drummed out. We deserve the public service that we get. If we don't actually ask and expect people to make mistakes and learn from them and take risk, then don't be surprised that you get very risk-averse public figures, and as a result, we're not making the bold leaps we need to go to. And I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about how Nagesh and I are nonpartisan senior executives. We do not identify with any party affiliation. But again, if you don't give us the permission as members of the public to make risk, to take mistakes and learn from it, then don't be surprised that the status quo is what continues. Because there really is no IPO at the end of the day in public service. I mean, we're never going to go public. We're never going to get a stock deal. So what is the upside of taking risk other than a job well done? That's about it. So let me give you 4 things, and then I'll actually turn it over to Nagesh, and he can take it away with his views, on things that we can think about how we can do public service differently. So I mentioned already, if you had trust that your data was going to be kept anonymous and private, would you be willing to volunteer information? I parachuted into the FCC in August of 2013. There had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, which is always a good sign for CIO number 10 that things must be swimming over there and going great. They also were paying about $4 to $5 million a year to test broadband connections with volunteers to see if Verizon and AT&T and other ISPs were really giving you the broadband speed they promised. And so we wanted to crowdsource this. And we wanted to write an app that would allow you, if you wanted to provide your information to the FCC. But you can imagine the events of 2013 saying, hi, I'm with the US government. Would you like to download an app that will monitor your broadband connection? Probably not going to be so successful. But we made the app open source. We made the terms and conditions only 2 pages long, and I would submit, when was the last time you ever agreed to anything on the internet that only had 2 pages long terms and conditions? And if you looked at the code, and recognizing most people aren't going to take the time, but the ACLU and the AFF did, you saw that by design, we didn't know who you were in a 5-mile radius. By design, we did not know your IP address. And so they actually came out and said, yea, verily, they're doing exactly what they said. It's privacy by design. And this was an app to, again, see if you were getting the broadband speed that you were promised. And it turned out to be the 4th most downloaded app for a while, right behind Google Chrome in early 2014. So think about other things we do, whether it be for public safety or whether it be for water quality, air quality. If you had trust that your data was being kept anonymous and private, we could reinvent how we inform making our communities healthier and safer. Second, how many people have heard of Crisis Commons? If not, check it out. It was actually an effort that started at first in Europe and then came to the United States. And Crisis Commons was the idea that anyone that had an SMS phone, you didn't even have to have a smartphone, could share what they were seeing. So if you saw some violence occurring, if you saw some disruption, if there was something bad going on, you could text that and it would be shared within your location. And so when the earthquakes happened in Haiti, SMS texting was still available. And people started texting saying this bridge is down, this water's flooded over here, the power line is down, we need hospital supplies over here. And this actually provided situational awareness far better than anything that could be provided by the local government or by the foreign aids of other countries. And in fact, there were two individuals, sisters, one of which was 9 months pregnant. She started to go into labor. And so her other sister is trying to drive her to the hospital. And along the way, she's encountering problems with the road or the bridges. And so she's using SMS to update her Facebook page. And that allows the US Navy that had a hospital ship to see that feed and to send a 6-person team to their location and bring them back to the hospital ship where she was able to successfully give birth. It's what David Brin talks about, which is called surveillance from the bottom up, as opposed to surveillance from the top. If you think about what happened in New York about 2 months ago, we were looking for a suspect. And it was a case of where we did the equivalent of a community watch. Now that doesn't mean there won't be misinformation. That doesn't mean there won't be false information. But if you do enough eyes on it, that can overpower any one person trying to bias the information that's being shared. And so what are other experiments that we may need to consider? I just raise as a question. The other example over there, have you done folding at home? Has anyone done that? Or SETI at home? So SETI, you're probably aware, folding at home came out later. It was the idea that you could use your screensaver, or when your computer was not doing processing cycles, to try and figure out how two-dimensional molecules folded up, because this is important for medicine. And it turned out they came up with at least 6 different new medicine cures from the processing power of people's PlayStation 3s just sitting idle. And now think about what you have in your pocket with your smartphone. According to some, you have more computing power than President Reagan had through the Pentagon in 1981. What other tasks could we do harvesting that power together? This may sound a little bit odd, although it's getting a little bit more mainstream, that in 2013 there was a competition to see if anyone could write an AI algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, that could grade papers as good as a third grade teacher. Find the same sentence mistakes, find the same sentence errors, or if it was a mathematics, find the same mathematics errors, multiplication errors, things like that. And for $60,000, someone actually won that competition on Kregel. It was a hedge fund trader that had some free time. 2014, Xerox comes out with a copier that will take handwritten questions, handwritten answers with no a priori programming and grade it at the equivalent of a third grade teacher. Now, it's more expensive than a teacher, so they're not out of jobs yet, but it shows what's possible. 2015, IBM Watson and other AIs are being tested to see which meetings you should go to, which meetings you should not go to, and if you do go to those meetings, who should you take with you to be more productive? Also in 2015, actually an AI was actually voted to a board of directors for a hedge fund and given voting rights. 2016, there's actually interesting advances where there's 2 competitions going on. One is a competition right now to see if anyone can write an AI that will answer real estate law as good as a real estate lawyer. And right now they have one that gets questions right 70% of the time. So if you're looking for a future job, that's probably not the profession I would recommend you go into. Also in 2016, California is also using machine learning to help set bail decisions. And it's twofold. One, there's certain things that shouldn't factor into your bail decision. Your height, your weight, your gender, your race, that should not matter. And so you can see with the AI, it's not taking those inputs in. But then 2, it's going back and it's reviewing the cases to see if there's a human bias to the decisions that were made in the past that is misinforming the machine. So it's also exposing that bias and allowing us to correct that as well. And so I raise the question as to what do we do in public service that is rote, rule-based, and repetitive, not because we want it to be that way, but because we want to remove any one person from biasing the system. And if instead you make it actually a machine learning algorithm in which you expose the algorithm, you can allow it to be more open and transparent and ideally more fair for us all. And then lastly, how many people have heard of the makers movement? I would assume this crowd would be pretty well versed. I raise this because it's a wonderful example of the super empowerment of individuals. And that to me is what the next 20 years is going to be. Individuals are going to have capabilities that were only available to nation states 30 or 40 years ago. And that's going to create interesting opportunities, great things you can do, and huge challenges. On the opportunity side, these 3 individuals over here, for less than 45 bucks, using a Raspberry Pi, produced a urine-powered generator that could actually power their community at night so they could read and they could actually become educated. That happened in Nigeria. Over here in Ghana, using less than $60 with an SMS flip phone and a Raspberry Pi, they built a baby monitor that can monitor 40 different vital signs and regularly update it using SMS text to any doctor in the world. That's the good side. Now the downside, Mumbai terrorist attacks, they use GPS. They use social media. They used the web search to both plan and unfortunately figure out who they wanted to assassinate when they did those attacks. Technology is amoral. It's how we choose how to use it that determines whether it's good or bad. And so we're going into a world in which people are going to be super empowered. And most of them probably are going to use it for mundane purposes and or cat videos. And that's okay. Hopefully you all will be encouraged to actually be a change agent and use it as a force for good. But we need to recognize one interesting stat. Per the NIH, in any random group of people, 1 to 2% are psychopaths. Now this is a non-random group, so that's okay. And it's also recognizing that psychopaths not necessarily are always criminals. You don't want your mortician or your surgeon to have the same emotional response to hurting someone in the middle of surgery that you and I might have. But recognizing that's the case, as we go in less than 6 years to 8 billion people on the face of the planet, we're looking at between 80 and 160 million psychopaths on the face of the planet that will not have the same emotional response to hurting people that you and I might have. When we see right now in Taiwan that for less than $1 million, you can create personalized medicine from scratch, customized to your DNA. And we don't pause and say Moore's law is going to play out, and so in 10 years that's going to be $100. And that means personalized medicine is also personalized poison customized to your DNA. How are we going to do national security? How are we going to do law enforcement? How are we going to just do the business of being a civil society that is actually going to be coexisting in this world order? These are questions that are not being asked, that need to be asked, and need to involve you as positive change agents. Just another sort of stat to give you a sense of the scale of the change that we're facing. Internet Protocol version 4, that's how we address things on the internet, or we did. We actually ran out of numbers about a year ago. It was 4.3 billion addresses. Anything that was a web server, FTP server, things like that had one. We ran out of those numbers about a year ago. That was the internet you knew. Now we're adopting Internet Protocol version 6, which is 2 to the 128th numbers. Any guesses as to what the equivalent size of the internet will be? The internet you knew is the beach ball. The internet you're going to know in the next 6 years is going to be the size of the sun. And again, this is going to challenge how we do cybersecurity, how we do privacy, civil liberties, how we work together as societies. The jury is out as to whether or not representative democracies will be able to move with the speed and alacrity needed to address these issues. Or will autocracies and oligarchies outperform, and then we're not surprised when unfortunately we lose what I truly value about the United States, which is our freedoms. And so this is the conversation we need to have together about where we're going, and it's why the conversation needs to be about public service and how we work together. So I'm going to leave you with one optimistic note to pass it on to Nagesh. I don't want to leave them all down right before you get them. Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, every human being who ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. We're going to need more change agents for our exponential times. Thank you for this initial intro. I'll now pass it on to Nagesh, and we'll go from there.